I would like to say hello to everybody and welcome you all to this early Christmas present that Andy Penaluna is providing to us today. And Andy was a former professor of the creative entrepreneurship at University of Wales Trinity St. David in UK and director of the International Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship. So he's a thought leader in Europe about the education for enterprising creativity beyond just only business and management, something that we especially are looking for in the area of sustainable entrepreneurship. He has been training educators in 48 countries all across the world. He was leading the QAA guideline for higher education in the UK in the field of entrepreneurship and enterprise education. And so many more things that don't fit into as an introduction into that webinar. So before I hand over to Andy to let him introduce a little bit also himself from his background, I would like to just say a few words about the Intrinsic project and why we are doing this, and also the format that we are having today together. So Intrinsic is an Erasmus Plus project, and we are aiming to empower life science university teachers to implement sustainable entrepreneurship education into their regular courses. We are looking for approaches that are evidence-based and that can be implemented into the mindset of teachers. So they pick up the major elements that are needed to help their students to become more enterprising and better entrepreneurs during their careers later. This is a webinar, so that means you see a video of me, you see of course a video of Andy. I will switch off my video then, and you have the opportunity, and I would really like to invite you to pick up the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A. I will have a look on that. And after the webinar of Andy, we are going through these questions and we will hopefully have a lively discussion. And with this, I would like to hand over the whole thing to Andy Penaluna, and I'm very much looking forward to his presentation. Thank you for joining us, Andy.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope you like the intrinsic me there. I'm wearing the same shirt, so you know it really is me. Okay, I always get a little annoyed when people don't reference earlier stuff, and I have to say that you've had some fantastic speakers here already. So if we look at the sort of Margaret Tack's work in Estonia or Martin's work on harmony, we've got a Harmony Institute on entrepreneurship in my own university. You know, these sorts of things are very, very helpful, seeing beyond what's in the curriculum and asking what's just beyond it. You've had some great stuff, and of course we probably all, and I consider myself to be a fan of Colin Jones, so that's my humor there for Colin. So again, another little thing, we often have speakers but you don't know where they're coming from, so I'm going to very, very quickly go through a series of slides that simply say where I'm coming from. So as a designer, and that's meaning being flexible, adaptable. I can't be like that as a researcher because I need strong definitions. So I'm an educator who's looking forward, and I'm also a freelancer, and I've been running my own businesses since I was 22 years old. When I was trained as a design student, I was graded in these two directions. You know, from relying on the educator to being independent, and from being undertaking very simple tasks to really complex and importantly ambiguous tasks. So of course, if we look at Colin's work, and we work with him on this, the pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy model works, and guess what, it lines up with the Entrecomp framework as well. So when we look at what we've done, for example, with Norris and colleagues, many colleagues have put this together, Kari Moberg, you will find this sort of advancement being seen in those two dimensions, coming from simplicity to complexity and hopefully becoming a more independent learner, ready to learn for life. So as for me, my learning took place in environments like this. I ran an international art magazine. I used to put together international conferences and exhibitions of artists and things like that. And it was a pretty successful business, 5-language magazine. But I never called myself an entrepreneur. It was just something I did as a designer. I love curiosity. If you really want to get curious, have a conversation with a 7 or 8-year-old on Twitter. And this is one of my teachers. Okay, I do teacher training and schooling here. So this is one of my teachers. And just so you can see that in action as part of the ENTRICOMP Edu project, here we have sort of 10 and 11-year-olds teaching teachers from all around Wales. And they are the best people to put over some of these messages because they know what it means to them. And if you look at the little group of pupils there, you can see what fun this is as well. And they're very, very curious. Of course, in my own area, I work with students who've really got to grips with complex thinking. And as can be seen on the charts behind these two students, many answers to problems, not just one. And that, I think, is always a key. I find when I work with researchers, in this case, the Researcher to Innovator program for Set Squared, I'm a translator. I'm constantly working between different disciplines and helping people to work together. Try doing that with PhD and postdoc students who've got really used to sitting in a silo. And then, of course, there's all sorts of policy engagement. And what really hit me, this is the European Parliament in 2016. The blonde lady is Kath, who you might know is my wife and partner in this. The number of times we heard the students saying they didn't learn it in education, the things they were talking about, and they expressed how they learned it. It was a constant message from the 22-year-olds it was missing from education. And I hear this all over. So just by way of example, here's a couple of meeting rooms in the United Nations and the OECD. And when we have these conversations, what really hits me, so often it can be a different body, but it's the same conversation. So that's why when we launched the QAA, we had the support of the European Commission and the United Nations. But what I really like you to look at is not just the QAA, which started 8 years ago, but look at what's happened since. So you've got the ETC toolkit, which looks at enterprise and entrepreneurship from any discipline at all. So you can look at that as you wish and take from that. We've also got support for educators, a range of standards, and this one came out last year, which helps people to link their teaching ability and what they're doing in terms of leadership, for example, against a national framework. So these are things that sit alongside the QAA and really followed on from it. And of course, ENTRICOMP being one of those things that QAA fed into amongst many other people. So I'm going to start backwards. I'm going to start by saying, what do we assess? What are we looking for? If we're going to be educators, what are we trying to do? Are we looking at our performance? And are we also, as I just suggested, looking at the learner performance, but our performance as well? So we have to think of the expertise, what motivates us. Are we looking for grades? Are we looking for formative that helps learners to develop? Are we looking for innovation or implementation? They're quite different. Innovation, you don't know the answer. It's going to surprise you. Implementation, you're doing as you're told. And so on and so forth. And who's actually involved there? So if we don't have clear goals, how do we measure? And who sets the criteria? And so often we forget, can't alumni evaluate? Can't alumni, I'll come into that at the end, but our alumni, can they evaluate how useful it's been? So different types of assessment are the sort of things you find typically in an HE environment. The short-term module, and we're expected quick, clean, get some kind of mark or grade that we can give the learner so that it contributes to their qualification. But of course, we know how limited that is, especially if we're trying to change behavior. Medium term, well, yeah, okay, that's seen as an end goal. What grade did you get for your university? But of course, the real insights are not there. The real insights are when you actually keep in touch with those students and they tell you what they found or didn't find useful. So types of assessment again, clear goals or definition stances. Well, that's good for research and measurement, but it's predicted. So you are being the creative person, not the student. So is it a general aim, or does it give this interpretation? Is it subject-based, relevant to the learner? Or is it entrepreneurship-based, where an entrepreneurship person comes into the subject? And that may lack relevance by comparison. So a little piece we did last year at ISB, we actually sort of delved into this and sort of thought, well, as this sort of specialist entrepreneurship educator, the real question is, do they actually understand the discipline they're walking into? Or if it's a specialist, do they understand the entrepreneurial side of things? Are they sufficiently aware? So one can map pre-existing competencies and the other can spot competency gaps in their own discipline. So sometimes that's a case of looking beyond your discipline to find out where you can get help, because the innovation capacity is central to all of this. Of course, that then takes us down to another stage about how educators use definitions. Because if it's goal and value based iterative innovation, there's a definitional dependency. We depend on those definitions. If it's process innovation, and that's radical innovation that you're not going to expect the answer, it's going to be new, genuinely new, you have to have that definitional flexibility. So that sort of sets the scene. And when this is a way at the moment, we're looking into it in the UK, thanks to Emily Beaumont for the slide, we're seeing that the people who are practitioners aren't too worried about this assessment story. And then when we draw them to the table and say, what about formative assessment? Then the message changes, because you're actually evaluating performance in order to aid further learning. But academics are very focused on this at the moment, as this chart sort of shows, on a range of areas. So this is a piece of ongoing work, and I look forward to the completion of this. So the learning journey. So often we have this, I've got a great idea I want to test. Well, fantastic. Let's start with entrepreneurship and startup. Very much a US model, perhaps. And then I need a challenge to get me thinking. I need to work with other people. Well, let's start with value creation then. Let's actually get out there and let's meet other people and work with them. Or I want to be an innovative problem solver. Well, then we start with creative capacity. How do I become more creative? How do I become someone who can come up with lots of ideas? And then, of course, we get to the top of this tree anyway, and something changes. So we've done all these things, we start all these points, and something changes. And now it's time to pivot. So we've all got to get creative in the end anyway. Back we go. So if you look at the UK definitions, really that is where the split is. The entrepreneurship zone is more about the understanding how to do business. And there's a lot of set ways of doing that. So that can be the implementation, the doing as told in many ways. But under that, the competencies that we're looking for, especially in sustainability, for example, are those below the line. We're looking at people who can be creative, innovative, and actually use that to create value for others. So the whole journey is a starting point, but the end point is pretty much the same. So when we think about these as an evaluator, we've got a measured knowledge bias here, because we kind of know what good business looks like and what procedures or taxation or business planning looks like. So we measure that. Value creation has a bias towards interpretation. What does the user think? What are the people we're working with? What do they think? Creative capacity has a performance bias, a process performance. How you go about it? Are you doing it the right way? And when we get to something that's changed, we come back to this interpretive bias. So just a little very quick flick at this. This is what we consider as our definitions in the UK, which I'm picking up on a lot today, I know. But so the broad competencies sit in the enterprise education, and the narrow business startups sit in the entrepreneurship education, which enables us to look at those two things differently and to evaluate what we're doing with the students differently. It also means that the enterprise education is close aligned to the needs of employees within small businesses, and creative people who make a difference, an entrepreneur in a business. So entrepreneurship, and again picking up on the sustainability agenda, there's a lot in common, and you're going to see this alignment being discussed a lot, certainly over the coming year or two. That's the actual definition from QAA if you do want to reference it. But essentially, it's this creativity, originality, initiative, ideas, so on and so forth. This flexible, adaptable individual is very good at us learning about entrepreneurship and how to do business, but we're not going to be entrepreneurs, we're going to be business owners at the best. So I've been following with great interest what's happening in COVID. And, we've had a rise, especially in research, on what they're calling the anxious parade of knowledge. And us academics are, a bit guilty of this. But what we do is we try and sort of put data in and try and make that sort of work for everything. However, this is what Conham McLean have found, and this is an abbreviation of their work, and they reported in McKinsey Quarterly what is happening in terms of businesses that are doing well in COVID. So they're curious, they accept that this ambiguity is going to be there, they vision through the eyes of others, they learn from other people, they just see it as an experiment, they don't see end goals, the best they can do at the moment. They tap into lots of people and more than they do, and they tell these interesting stories. So that can turn into questions. So what have you asked today? What is a fact? Whose shoes have you walked in? Etc., etc. And this is what we're using at the moment in teacher training, by the way. So let's look at those biases a little bit more. The measurement bias, okay, great. We can do the tests and examinations. We're relying on this sort of being correct. We can do the interpretation, and that relies on opinion and judgment. You see a lot of that in the art world that I'm from. Process performance bias. Well, this is actually more about reflective thinking and being able to sit back and explain why and how you did something or how things happen. Of course, data-driven includes, these artificial abstracted. They're very, very unreal in as much as we just tend to pick on things that are easier to measure. The obvious one being the business startup, for example. So it can relate to the positioning of the assessor. You see lots of blind spots and unforeseen limitations, because it never really reflects reality, just a piece that the researcher wishes to investigate. Critical analysis is obviously the goal, but critical synthesis is overlooked. So I'd just like to mention that. Critical synthesis means you can join and connect complex things in new ways and explain why you have. You've got to actually see opportunities to connect things, not just do it. So you've got to spot these things, and you've got to be future orientated. Now, this takes a type of thinking that I'm not discussing here today, but insightful thinking is that we go, oh yes, why didn't I do? Oh yes, I've just had this idea come to mind. Analytical thinking is what we tend to deal with a lot. We don't tend to spend so much time on the insightful, creative thinking. They are different, by the way, neurological constructs. So that means you'd be curious. It requires disruptions to the learning. And it requires deep reflection. And it also requires darn good communication skills, because if something is new and complex, you need to be able to tell that story. I often feel like this. This is one of my little pastimes, little business, but it's also like my teaching. I can set off a firework. I have no idea if they're all going to work. I have no idea if all the fuses are going to work in the timing I've done. But I hope at the end it's an enjoyable experience for the audience. So, I often think this is a good metaphor for being an educator here. So the type of memory is so important. Analytical is easy to track. That's what we do typically. Rote learning, it's the obvious one. Insightful is fleeting. If you don't write it down, you often forget, for example. So you need to capture it. And if we do go into the literature on this, you'll find that We talk about semantic marking of brain cells, individual brain cells. This makes a difference between the way that we think. It's like having a friend or a new friend and what you remember about them. So we know there's different types of memory, from sensory, which is momentarily, working memory, and long-term. We know that we can break that down into explicit, what we can talk about, and what is implicit, things we just don't realize are going on. What we can declare or what we actually use to do things. Go and make yourself a cup of tea or something and remember what you've done exactly. And of course, episodic memory helps us to remember that. And that together is an area that it's often just sidestepped in assessment. So by actually pulling that episodic memory, how we did things and putting things together, and the episode, the narrative, the story, we can put that back in the working memory. And by recycling that around the system, that helps the learning. Which responds to synaptic efficiency bit about, are we looking at certain solutions or plasticity? Are we adaptable, flexible, and learning? So it says one thing, you actually read something else. You know what's going on there. And this is my world as well. This is advertising. And when you see things like this, and when you next hear a good joke, be aware of your reaction. That is insightful thinking. That's when you suddenly realize it snaps into consciousness. So when you see another slide like this, sometimes you have different reactions. And it's really interesting to me when I watch different groups of people, because some people say, oh, you've got a blank slide, and then they dismiss any further thinking. Other people go, why have you got a pure slide in white? Why have you got a slide that reminds me of the wedding, or the fact that looking behind certain background element, we've got snow. So, there's things going on in your mind you're not aware of. So sometimes you need to try and pull out what that subconscious is saying. And what we do so often is we start off with this concise, well-defined problem, and we've got the solution sorted out. We give it to the students, and it's fair to give students exactly the same thing over the same time. It's easy to predict, but good gosh, we miss so many other alternatives. So let's revisit that, because if this was one of my PhD students, this is the level of argumentation I would want. So we start with divergent. This is opening your mind. Wicked problem, no one's got the right answer. Let's try and solve it. And then, oh, guess what? Did you see the news today? Well, that changes things. So let's reconsider it with today's news into account. That's the sort of thing you can do to encourage the development of ideas. You keep disrupting them and bringing new information, so they have to constantly adapt and change. This is something I've been doing now for about 35 years. And so, we get this range of ideas as opposed to the one idea. Of course, once you've got those, you can either pick one, or you can mix and match them, or you can do whatever you want. Typically, we start with a process that is the convergent thinking. We don't capture all of those things. So if we come into looking at the convergent thinking, so often, well, let's have a quick brainstorm. Let's have a morning session on ideas. Instead of developing with knowledge all these different ideas, we just go for the first things that are to hand, the low-hanging fruit, the obvious things. And then we start to simply discard the things we don't want. And that's the analysis coming in. But if you use both, it evidences your creative thought, mirrors real life, develops adaptability, flexibility, and resilience. Things we keep talking about. So here's a quick example for you. This is a real project my students did. You're in a floodplain, water's gone. You can read the story for yourself there. And the students are just told, well, okay, the children need help. What are you going to do? And you don't tell them there's children there. They realize there's children there. So they start to ask questions. Well, can I look up floodplains? Can I discover where the water's gone? How long do droughts last? Plenty of working time, 3 hours at midday is the only time we can't work. Oh, debris, maybe we can use that as a resource. Maybe we can use the buildings that are left there. Maybe there's some underground water if there's damp spots. And then all the things that they can do as the agent of change. Can I communicate? How can I communicate? What skills do they have? So on and so forth. And positioning themselves as the agent of change. So quite easily then they can, find how the water irrigates land. That's searchable. They can learn about droughts. They can do long-term planning and thought and see how that's done. And they can look at different debris and what it offers. And they can think about that drying. Is that going to be useful at all? They can think a little bit deeper about water-seeking devices. And what skills do they have to actually make some sort of effect here? So they actually illustrate this as a series of charts. And they can link things together in different ways. This is just one example of a real student project. So maybe the drawing is the one that's standing out there and debris are being looked at differently. We can see to the left already this long-term planning and droughts are already aligned by the students. They've made that connection. You've not made it for them. And then you can come up with the EP stands for evidence prototype in our world, which is something like minimum viable product. So they have to come up with as many as they can. And they're evaluated on how many, not just the same one. If we then take that a step further, they can take those prototypes and tie them back down, like in the model we saw just now of analytical thinking. And then we can come up with other ideas, but fewer of them, more focused ones. And here you can see the side with them as an agent of change. So if you want to know more about that, I've just put the detail about the book chapter in there, because I talk about the neurological side and the brain functionality that leads to these sorts of things. But this is actually a simplified version of what the students' work looks like. It's not unusual to find these 6 or 7 foot long. And the deeper and more complex they are, the more you have a conversation and the more thinking is there for you to evaluate. They learn to think, not to remember. So yeah, guess what? That's all made up. No, it isn't. It's partially made up because it's based on a real project being born in Manila, where students went there and made jewelry out of the rubbish on the rubbish tip. And from that, they found through their networks and contacts, American shops and places that would, and UK shops that would buy this jewelry and so on and so forth. Now, at the time this was put together about 3 years ago, there was £22,000 had been raised. I understand now there's 40 solid buildings there from nothing, from these students just going in and working with waste in the sort of environment we talked about. So there's a real connotation, but they don't hear about this till after they've come up with their own solutions. Now, I said I'm from design, so I just had to throw that in. If you're familiar with the Ecosystems app, this is all the different ideas that went into the possible brand, and the one that was chosen by the client is at the top there. So you can see that many of these would work, but they have to be considered. The more ideas you've got, the more choice you've got. So how do I assess that? Well, okay, student briefing on a task, and you tell them how many ideas are required. So and then you have what we call crit groups, which are peer groups, which are led by the assessor. So the initial ideas are discussed and critiqued for the uniqueness of each potential. It's not how many can you have now, it's how many can you have that you can prove are different. And then as you go through a course, there's this change. So that accelerates the thinking to more ideas. So when you're then looking at these more ideas, you can start to sort of press this point home that they need to be different. And then you introduce a bit more. So guess what happens then? Well, overly similar ideas, ones that are pretty much the same thing with just a tweak or two in them, get combined or discarded because they're basically the same thing. And that doesn't help us at all. We're looking for creative solutions. So we have this crit and then we change the information. The crit is this discussion where we share and other students can say, look, isn't that the same as that idea? And actually, you're not teaching them here. They're learning for themselves. And then we come to the complex end, the complex tail. What we end up with here as well is often overlooked, are what we call perceived performances. Those are the ones with a circle with an arrow in them. And that is when I come up with an idea, but we'd never have the money for it. I come up with an idea, but the technology isn't there for it yet, or so on and so forth. So they get parked So they get banked, but they're still ideas for the future. And finally, of course, we look at the summative assessment at the end, which is when the students are asked to produce X number of results, and they are assessed on the individuality of each result when compared to the other, which is really easy to map when you look through those charts. And again, it's a case of not so much the educator telling them, but they become aware for themselves just by seeing each other's charts. So we used that when we were putting together the QAA guidance. And rather than look at expertise in business schools, we looked for expertise full stop. Where was it? And by the way, Intricomp did a similar thing. Who did what? Who did best? Would I really think that a business educator alone is going to teach me to be persuasive? Probably not. I probably act as someone who's good at acting. They're very persuasive, and their education system supports that. So we discovered along the way so many claims for newness that pre-existed in other disciplines. You know, we often talk about the through, the for, about. I don't know how many people who know that it actually came from sports. It's not enterprise and entrepreneurship at all. It pre-existed for some time in sport. So critical synthesis is easy to support when you look outside of the entrepreneurship box. And here's a little sort of clues to a few of the things. So pivoting and all that. Well, art and design, my background, yes, music, history, believe it or not. History is often working with incomplete evidence. And then we looked at performing arts in this challenge, and that's very much when we talk about value creation, there's a lot of common ground with performing arts and the sports. So that's just a start of the sort of things that we used. I said at the beginning that before I finished, I'd mentioned something about how you can be evaluated by your own students many years after they've gone. And I've been tracking students now since, this is scary, but 1985. And I've been keeping in touch with them, and they've been telling me what's been helpful in their education and what hasn't. It doesn't always sit well when you're told something hasn't worked, but you learn from it. So this model, the continuous conceptual review model, we formalized in 1996, I can hardly believe it, and presented it in academic work in the mid-2000s. And this is still ongoing. So you ask alumni, you test the students' perceptions, you deliver. Usually you don't motivate, you let the alumni do it. It is extremely powerful. The alumni will say things that you could never say, and they'll say things that make connections to why you're doing things much more relevant to the learner, which hits on that motivation. And guess what? This is the feedback that I get. This is from a review I did that was published in a conference. And what they valued most out of all that system is the ability to act flexibly and adaptably. Now that was a group of over 25 years of students. I can't remember the exact number in that particular one. I think it's about 300, maybe 500. But the point here is nobody disagreed with it. And if you look at the purple and the blue, almost all the students said that was the best thing they got from their education, which certainly helps me to understand what the offer is. So we often say the creativity of a system cannot surpass the creativity of its teachers. This is from the Royal Society of Arts and some work we did in combination with Drexel University. Drexel, by the way, are the people who do the cognitive neurology who've informed us. And as John, one of the lead academics there, says, perhaps we should all get design training. So here's some final thoughts. Is there potential disconnection with practice, national, international policies? Are we talking about these things? Are we advancing because people like me perhaps are getting their messages out and I can control and influence, or is it should be working on prediction or causality? Do we need, I think this one's important, do we need more entrepreneurial subject specialists, or do we need more entrepreneurship educators? They are quite different goals, as we've seen earlier. So if you want to read any more, there's a little list I've just given you there. And you'll notice the last 3 have come out in the last 2 months. So this is all new stuff. And there is one more as well we've done, but we've been a bit busy. So the links are there because they're not actually in print yet. So there we will leave it. Knowledge, experience, and creativity. And to me, that really is what Intrinsic is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy, also for this very, very nice end of the presentation. And I think it's the creativity of all people involved in this educational effort that can bring what we are all aiming for. That is maybe a new generation of students that are better prepared than maybe this generation or whatsoever. And before the questions pour in via the Q&A, and I really would like to invite all people to take the opportunity to ask questions to Andy, then I will read those questions to you, Andy, and you can then answer those questions. I would like to start with let's say, it sounds maybe simple, but it is not. Maybe there is this. You said there is this subject specialist in life sciences. We have these subject specialists. We have them. They are already to a certain degree involved in innovation, as universities are pillars of innovation to a certain degree, but not necessarily they are involved or are trained in educating their students for that. So what is in your experience, what is the best way for those domain specialists to educate their students or prepare them better for these behaviors, which means maybe, first of all, a change of a mindset in the teacher in the beginning, but then what would be those main activities that you have identified during your learning history to be implemented?
Okay, I'll start by saying that this is something I meet a lot when I was working for Set Squared, when we were working with high-end researchers, and as my friend Simon used to say, with brains the size of planets. So what we've actually got is a lot of people in a room who know a lot about their own discipline, but don't know very much about each other. Now, we have lots of things that we do, tasks we give them, but I'll share the first one. We put colored pieces of paper on the floor. We ask them to find the correct route in teams. The teams are allowed to have one person in the room and one person as an observer. The rest have to stay outside the room and they're independent. So what they have to do then is come in and we act as judges. And if they stand on the wrong color, and these are all blue, yellow, green, it looks very random. And it's across the room. If they choose the wrong color, we just go, no, and they have to get off. The observer comes onto the front seat, and then the other person goes, and a new person comes in to be the observer. So the people in the room are one step away all the time of what's actually happening when they go back to their room to discuss. Now, it takes the academics between an hour and an hour and a half to find the right route. They don't even cheat and look at each other and see what the other teams are doing. It is phenomenal to watch. So what we then do is we show them a video of children from a primary school in Wales with the same task. And we say to them, okay, let's watch this video. We do speed it up, but they do it in 7 to 11 minutes. So our beginning question to the academics is, what have you forgotten that you used to know as a child? And it was this willingness to act. So that becomes the very first stepping stone, this willingness to act, and you can build on that. So that's what I would, just one particular project I'd recommend. And when you see the children doing it compared to the academics, it's quite scary what we've forgotten.
Yeah, I really think that this is also a core element of Intrinsic to implement this willingness to act at the life science universities, at the mindsets of teachers. We have already some of them, but of course we would like to roll it out and we have still 1 year to go with the Intrinsic project, and we will have in the end of 2021 we are going to have a conference in Vienna about sustainable entrepreneurship education that I'm going to announce right now for the first time. So let's see how it will take place, either online or in
Before
person.
before I
Yeah,
forget, can I just throw in, please take a look at the QA website tomorrow,
yeah.
because tomorrow we are launching for consultation, and one of the authors may even be on the call here, um, a new document about education for sustainable development. And everybody from enterprise will look at it and go, yes, that's the alignment we've been asking for.
Yeah, so that's really something. The sustainability and education for sustainability links up to much of the competences of the enterprising individual. And
Absolutely.
there is a question from the chat. You wrote clear goals and definitions may hinder opportunities to develop divergent thinking that takes account of multiple perspectives.
Mhm.
This may not be surprising for people who work in creativity, design, and entrepreneurship, but what can this perspective bring to general education or people who still think conventionally? So, what can this perspective bring to us normal thinking people, or how we can say it?
Well, I think, to be fair, it's because of COVID, it's starting to happen anyway. And if you look at, the theoretical side, like effectuation that's being discussed, these things help enormously, because you have to move to a goal that is achievable, usually in a short period of time. So if you define the final outcome prematurely, we call that premature articulation, by the way. That's when you actually go to do something without really thinking it through. So if you move as far along a step as possible and meet whatever interim goal you've got, is this pivoting and shifting. So if you bring in pivoting and shifting into the educational experience, thus simulating real life, it automatically happens. So instead of going to an end goal, maybe not the first time you do this, but if you keep going towards an end goal, then you're going to come unstuck if you just stick to that end goal when you're assessed and evaluated in that way.
Mhm. So so as I can see it now, I have a lot of teachers who for sure are realizing that there is something new to be implemented in higher education. One question is higher education responsible for implementing this? So is it me? Is it an agricultural scientist? Am I responsible? And I would say yes, because that is the convincing thing is that I should make my students more flexible to adapt to the new situation. So it should be really at the basis of my interest to
Yeah,
equip my students with these competencies.
I think this is a lesson that I learned, and I alluded to it, that because I kept in touch with alumni, I was able to find out what they had to say about their education. I also run businesses. What
Hmm.
business does not find out what the customers think long term?
Mm.
Now, I'm going to be on a panel tomorrow, and I'm
Hmm.
going to propose that universities have a warranty. If you come to a university that claims to do this, that, or the other, and it doesn't happen, this is just something to stir up thought, by the way. It's not.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But, what do you actually do what you say you're going to do? And all too often, we're this knowledge, you know, uh, nervous knowledge people. We're just putting out lots and lots of knowledge. We need knowledge harvesters, not necessarily just knowledge retainers. We still need knowledge retention, health and safety. Even you need to know how to do something, even hold a knife. So we do need that implementation assessment on those sorts of areas. But in terms of innovation assessment, the two I's, I've not put it on the list. I don't think, maybe I have, but just type in OECD, comma Penaluna, and it will come up, and you'll find out about the difference between different goals you can create through innovation or implementation, and the questions that you can ask. So hopefully that will sort of cover it. I've just noticed there's a comment from Brazil. Great. That document, the one from 2008 was actually a conference presentation in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo. So there's a good connection there, and that's what we first talked about, the way that we used alumni.
Yeah, so Brazil, I will come back to Brazil in a minute. So when we are having lively discussions on Twitter and Facebook, and I was asking, I think it was maybe Nordis or Colleen, I don't remember exactly, when I was asking what is the main characteristic of an entrepreneur, or let's say a person who is looking uh, for a creation of value. Yeah, what differentiates this person from another person? So which also means it can be the same person in development step A and development step B. Yeah, so what differentiates these two persons or this person development states? And the answer was the person is not satisfied with the status quo.
Yeah,
So that is so how, and I think we have that in young students. I think there is this, they have that. I think, yeah, students, they have that feeling of they are not satisfied with the status quo,
they're not
maybe.
satisfied with us, with our generation, for the mess
So
we've made.
whatsoever, but how would you say how to make that tangible in education? So how would you, let's say, improve this capacity of realizing the status quo, of anticipating or the wish to anticipate a change? So how
Mm.
could that be steered?
Well, again, I've not discussed it here, but
Hmm.
another of my jobs, I have a few now, I'm freelance, is helping to train military leaders. And they are people who have to work in a great deal of stress and make decisions that can affect the life or death of their troops, for example.
Hmm.
And what we found is, again, I've got a whole lecture on this, but what we found is making it fun,
Hmm.
making it future orientated. So you can give a task. I mean, one of my jobs in the past was doing science fiction movie conceptual art.
Hmm.
Do something like that and
Hmm.
say to a person, you've got a pencil, you haven't got a pen. So you can sketch out many, many ideas. You can
Hmm.
rub out, you can change.
Hmm.
It's not permanent, it's not fixed, it's
Hmm.
temporary.
Hmm.
And get someone to try and put two things together from today to guess a problem or a solution in the future.
Hmm.
The moment you start that process, you're becoming entrepreneurial,
Yeah.
because you're looking beyond the here and now
Hmm.
to, if I take A and B and maybe C, put them all together, there's a possibility D will result. So how do I go about doing D? So to give that example of the classroom, my students are asked to invent jobs that don't exist yet.
Hmm.
And then they're asked to write a CV and a letter of application for that job. And then to check they've got the competencies, they have to have one of their team members in the room write them the job reference.
Yeah, so I think that this can be a real nice training for domain specialists who also could involve themselves into the process.
Yeah.
And here I think it comes also into play that maybe you let's say build some groups, and not in on an individual level this exercise can take place, right?
That's a very, very good point, because all too often, and I've done it today, I promised I
Hmm.
wouldn't, and
Yeah.
that is I'm learning about an individual, but we need to think about teams.
Hmm.
I started by saying, my wife is a bank manager who turned down my loan for my first magazine business,
Mm.
but she's my partner, and I learned so much from her, and she from I, and we're quite different people. Together, we make a team.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think that's really also this team-based um, creativity that can be achieved. I think, and taking a status quo and developing together some future products or a better state. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
especially at life science universities, this can be a simple but very effective teaching activity.
Yeah, I mean, I've been chatting to Martin about this, because so often when you do value creation, you're
Hmm.
just looking at the immediate need.
Hmm.
You're not looking at this step forward need. So in the design education I'm from, there's a lot of training goes on about how do you work with outside people, how do you check that the offer is valuable to your students, and so on and so forth. So it's a slightly different type of value creation, because you start with simulation, and you simulate and you accelerate, as in the example I showed.
Mhm.
You accelerate the learning, so when they do go out and work with people, they've already got talent and ability that can be applied.
Yeah, I think that's something that is also that I'm also a little bit afraid of going out to work with real people sometimes because that's the real challenge, right? So the real world is something that we have to incorporate somehow into the teaching. Otherwise, it remains, let's say, a little bit uh, empty, right? So
Absolutely, yeah.
so you would also effective enterprise and entrepreneurship education always has a link to the outside reality. So it can not only be simulated within just the course. What do you think? So is this?
I would go outside as well. I always have done. And in fact,
Mhm,
that's been a common thing. We take our students from a learning environment to progressively introducing them to situations from external agencies and bodies, so
mhm.
that we are sure that the development, is staged and is appropriate.
Ah, yeah.
And again, it was Johnny who asked the question earlier on about the clear goals, because your goals have to be flexible enough to accommodate change.
Mhm,
And this is where we come to the wicked problems.
mhm,
If we choose problems where there are no perfect answer, where the answer is not already known, and we
mhm.
start from that point, it gives us that definitional flexibility that's being looked for in the world of success as we see it at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. There is this Corona busters here just around the corner. They
Yeah.
have set up a stand with rapid tests. Yeah, so there is the people pick ideas up quickly. Yeah, and then they make something out of it. And yeah, but it's only a few people, right? It's not everyone is not doing that. It's just some people who have that idea, who have the energy, and so there is so much space that
Mm.
can be filled with creative action out there. That is what I realize. And but Nigel is asking here, how do we persuade some academics that your bracket our approach to enterprise education is acceptable at level 7 in universities? So how
Um,
to persuade academics?
the way that I've done it in the past,
Mhm,
and I've had this situation many a time now. I was a visiting professor at one high-ranking university, and we had this very problem. Basically, what I did was during the conversations, I pointed questions at the academics about creative thinking and calling it complex cognition. And all too often, people go, "Oh, that's just a soft skill. You can't teach that." In fact, 2006, there's a lot of entrepreneurship literature that says you can't do that, which is strange to people like me. So then I sit down and go, well, okay, well, what's the type of thinking you're talking about there? I say, well, okay, but there's no shift or change or adaptability or, so how are you bringing that cognition skill along if you restrict it to that?
mhm,
And that's when it really comes into play, because a lot of academics don't think of it as complex cognition.
mhm.
And if you bring complex cognition in, it gives them something to hang, theoretical constructs on. And then the rest seems to come into play.
Yeah, so
Well,
how would you so the complex so how would you persuade the academics? So you would let's say
I do it through experience. I do it the same way as I do with the students.
yeah.
I set them a task and then I do things.
Mhm,
There's a teacher training thing I do where they come in to the room and partway through the project, I say, "Oh, what did you see this morning on the way in?"
mhm,
Actually, there's a whole paper on this I've done on this as well, how this is
mhm,
done. And they write, "Oh, I saw a cat, or I saw a feather fly out of the sky, or whatever it was." Then, "Oh, tell
mhm,
me another thing." "Oh, okay, write those down. Okay, carry on working." And they write them down. I say, "Oh, hang on a minute. Let's make this fun. Let's introduce those two things into your solution."
mhm,
And the example I give, because it's in this paper and I can remember it easily,
mhm,
is I had one student who was late. And so the student looked at the clock on the way in and go, "Ah, I'm late." So they remember the clock. And they also noticed the security camera. And so what they came up with as their solution was something that looked like a security camera going, "You have 12 seconds to come up with a good idea. 5, 4, and there you have it."
Ah, yeah,
So they
yeah,
bring in, and this is called remote compound association. If you want to look at the cognitive neurology on this, this is some of the terminology that's used.
Remote
And
compound
association. There's things called the RAT test, which are remote association tests. Remote compound association is how they look at it in terms of brain development.
Yeah, I think also so to persuade the academics is really a core element, and I think the better and the more evidence-based we present our approach, it will convince them.
Yeah,
I think most convincing is the alumni feedback. So the feedback of the alumni, we are also capturing that feedback for many years now, but not specifically on these aspects. But we might be able to implement new aspects related to this set of skills and begin to trace it. I think that's also very important. So we have this quality management unit who is running these evaluations, and but however, we are not learning much from the feedback, unfortunately. It's just out there, yeah. But I really think that these skills that alumni really need, and if the teachers see that it's not the content, it's all the other competencies that they acquired along with that content or along with the interaction with others, I think that's a huge argument, right? So my answer would be to Nigel would be to have that evidence from the alumni and from the real world that these competencies are so much relevant, and which then can help to implement them more systematically at the university level. So
it also moves it from this knowledge acquisition to competency acquisition.
Yeah, that's
the
true.
old talk about riding a bike or ride a bike. They are different things.
Yeah,
and so
true,
you can ask the academic who maybe is not happy, why are you saying that? How does that relate to what they're going to do when they leave the institution? And what are your goals? Is your goal to impart knowledge, or is your goal to help the student in that career?
Oh, we are already a little bit late, but there are some more questions. Are you still?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. So there is question about legitimacy. One of the findings is that many claims for newness pre-existed in other disciplines. How to determine then what is enterprise education? Can teaching activity in enterprise zone be considered legitimate on its own from the disciplinary perspective? So
it's quite a long question.
yeah, so I think the other disciplines say, well, this is creativity. At least this is how I understand it.
So I'm reading it now. I've got it here. Thanks.
Yeah.
It's Ina. Hi, Ina. Claims for newness pre-existed. I mean, there's so many things that I found now that we're getting the entrepreneur. Take effectuation. You can go back to work. Well, we talked briefly before about Gestalt theory, and by using association to bring things together. And there's so many things that we claim newness for, where if you look in other disciplines, they've already been used and they've already been evaluated, but the language might be different. So all too often as researchers, we tend to look, one, in the entrepreneurship literature, and two, we don't ourselves be flexible enough to understand that a different term in another discipline means pretty much the same thing. So if you get a lexicon of language and you start from that, that helps enormously. And then you sort of talk about this, what is enterprise education? Well, to me, enterprise education is this building up of the competencies and the knowledge to be able to come up to a business opportunity running on the ground. And that's why we make such a big distinction between entrepreneurship education, because once you're at that level, it's up to you as a learner. It's your decision as a learner. Do I take that forward into entrepreneurship? And again, if you look at the QAA, we've got what we call the Gateway Triangle, which Colin Jones helped with. Or do you decide, no, that's not for me, or it's not for me yet, because it might be something later. And what we've also found is people who start off at the top with the entrepreneurship, the very narrow, with dipping into the enterprise, suddenly realize when they're out, I mean, just look at the business failure rates from, dare I say, some business schools. And you can see they need to jump back down to the bottom because the failure rates are quite often, they haven't visualized these multiple alternatives. They've not even thought about, the fact that something else could happen from someone else's point of view. So the enterprise side is very much the foundation, and it's for all learners. The entrepreneurship is for those who want to take it forward or may want to take it forward in the future.
You see the so there is, was Nigel was saying, to dealing with the real world is vital, and our students change as a result. I can say everything that I learned, that I really deeply learned, I learned in let's say in conflict with the real environment. So that
I
deeply
think that's
changed
that's,
me.
that's true of many of us.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, just a quick anecdote, it's just my own one. I put together a course in advertising. I owned an advertising agency, and I knew what was needed. And so I brought that reality into the university. And the university immediately put a business educator and an art educator in as the externals, who argued, who disagreed. The whole thing was a mess. My university won't thank me for saying this. And this is the quality assurance team. So I was told to go away and forget about it. But I spoke to my alumni, and everyone was saying, Andy, this is really needed. There's many jobs. The world is changing. Being able to sell, promote are important things. So, try again. So I listened to my alumni. And the night before I went in with a slightly different title, it was the same thing, really. This time I was prepared with 7 or 8 of my students on Facebook. So I went into the meeting, and as I was being told off for being presenting the same thing, I turned on the slide, the projector, and said, well, before we begin, so I took the lead, before we begin, would you like to hear from some of your students, your past students from this university, what they think about the opportunities this course will offer them and other people? And immediately they started looking around the room, and you could see I'd caught them out. And then I shouldn't be sharing this, should I? But then I hit the Facebook button. I had 272 alumni ready to speak. So I knew many of them. So I was able to say, well, this one's working in Mexico. This is what they're doing. Do you want to ask them a question? This one's working in Israel. They're doing that. Would you like to ask them a question? This one now leads the design department of a multinational store. They're the top person. This one runs Manchester United's PR campaigns. Would you like to listen to them? Yeah. And the whole quality team had to give up and let me speak.
Yeah. So, and this to be honest, this answer really links to some of the questions in here. So how to convince people is to take leadership, right?
And it's
at a
also,
certain point.
Yeah, it is to take leadership and to take responsibility. But I was seeing the one with Keith's got in here, music stuff. I mean, there's some great work being done in Leeds on this, and I can always put you in touch if you want to contact me directly, because there's a PhD being done on this. And sometimes it's so difficult to pick up on everything that's happening around the world, but there are nearly always a pocket of expertise somewhere that will help you to pick up on that.
Well, I would say we have now reached the end of the questions, and there are some statements that really agree with what you have said. And I also would like to end this webinar at this level of high inspiration that you gave to us with this real life story about how things really happen, and that's really about taking responsibility. Taking the leadership for ideas, going into the system that per se doesn't want to change as it's a natural feature. So please, all participants in the webinar and also future participants in entrepreneurship education, take the lead, take the responsibility, pick up all that good knowledge that has been presented today and also in the other webinars, and go out there and help to educate a generation that's more flexible, adaptable, able to create new value for others related to sustainability, because we all want to live in a sustainable world.
Absolutely.
Andy, thank you very much for this inspirational hour and a little bit more.
Yeah, Practice
And
what you preach, everyone.
yeah, practice. So I'm trying hard to practice. I'm really trying to convince, and finding ways to take responsibility and leadership, because that's really, those people are able to change the world, right?
Absolutely. Go
Okay,
change the
so
world.
thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much, and see you later in some other occasion. Yeah, and thanks to
Take care.
everyone for participating.
Bye for now.
Bye.